On behalf of President Watts, Dr. Benoit, and the full leadership team of UAB, I just want to welcome you here. And again, thank each of you for the time that you took to take the survey and to show your level of engagement at whatever level that's been. So we very much appreciate that. Today is the second forum that we've had since we had the results. And we are intending to do this one a little bit differently. Back in July, we had a meeting where Rich Boyer from Modern Think, who's also here with us today, and you'll hear from Rich in just a second, presented the results of our survey, the overall results for all of UAB. That meeting was recorded, and it's on the UAB Engage site, which is the website that was created specifically for the engagement survey. So if you have seen that video, you're in luck. You're not going to have to see that again today. If you haven't, it's still out there and it's available for you to go out and watch that full video whenever you have the time to review that. But what we wanted to do is, because the results came out in the summer, we recognize that many of our faculty in particular, and even some of our staff, are not available in the summer to really fully get all of this information. So we wanted to have another meeting in the fall where we could go over those results. And so what we'll do today is have a brief presentation, and then we'll do this more as an open forum. So you'll have an opportunity to ask us questions, and we'll have a brief panel who will be able to answer those questions. And if we can't answer the questions, we'll make a commitment to get back to you. We really do want your thoughts and ideas about the best way to continue to move forward. And this is kind of where I was before. Is we started back in October of 2016 working with Modern Think to talk about how do we best implement this type of survey at UAB. We established an engagement steering committee, and in the course of that, some of the initial meetings of that steering committee, we realized that we needed to expand the membership of that committee, and so we did, to make certain that all of the key constituency groups across UAB were represented on this steering committee. And the members of the committee are listed there, and many of them I'm pleased to see are with us today. In December of 2016, we started holding focus groups, and we held several focus groups just so that we could hear kind of where we were starting from, and to make certain that as we crafted the survey with the types of questions that would address some of the concerns we heard in those focus group settings. And then in April of this year, we launched the survey, and we knew that participation may not be as great as we hope that it will be in later years, because this was our first survey. We also know that back in 2007, there was a survey done, and it was not of the same caliber of this survey, but it left a long shadow where there were concerns that because there wasn't the level of action after that survey, that this survey would also follow that same path. And there were a lot of discussions before we launched the survey in April with the leadership to make certain that there was the commitment that that would not be the case, and that continues to be the case. But I think Rich will show the participation rates. But then, as I stated before, in July, we started sharing the survey results. We've continued to roll those results out across the schools and the units, and we'll continue to do that and monitor how that's being done. But again, we thought it would be important that now in the fall that we host a second meeting to provide opportunities to get the results out there, but most importantly, one of the things we heard from the July meeting was that there wasn't enough time for questions. And so for communication. So we wanted to offer this type of forum to provide that opportunity for feedback and for questions. So that's kind of why we're here today, how we've gotten to this point. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Rich Boyer from Modern Think, who's been our senior consultant on this. And he's been just wonderful in helping us, given the fact that this is UAB's first time going through a survey like this, to understand best practice, but also in understanding best practices, make certain that it's presented in a way that's nimble enough that it fits into our culture and our organization and works best for us. So, Rich, if you will come up, and I think we've got the technology working now.
Terrific.
There you go.
Thank you, Alicia. Good to be here with you all again. I see many familiar faces and a number of new ones. So happy to have the opportunity for this follow-up conversation this morning. One of the things that would be helpful for me in terms of just where I focus our time here is if I could just get by a quick show of hands those who either attended any of the initial survey findings presentations we did or watched them via the intranet, the recording. Terrific. Excellent. Thank you. So what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is not intended to be a full findings presentation, but rather to kind of just reconnect us at a high level to the data, to stimulate some thinking for some of the questions and answers. We've got, I think, what I would characterize as a real powerhouse of a panel representing lots of different perspectives and experience who I think will be great resources for some of the questions that you may have. So in terms of teeing us up for that section of our presentation, let's, again, kind of just get reconnected in the survey. So as you saw, as Alicia mentioned, this was a very thoughtful process on the part of UAB. While our formal conversation started in October of 2016, Susan Cohen had been working behind the scenes with a couple of my colleagues at Modern Think talking about best practice and how to go about this, particularly at an institution the scale, size, complexity of UAB. So lots of work went into this. Among the work products that came out was not only the plan that included those focus groups that we did to get kind of an initial baseline and inform the survey process and inform what we needed to do to make sure we were targeting the right questions and doing the things that are necessary to get good response rates. So in addition to that work, that steering committee also spent a fair bit of time working on the survey instrument itself. So for those who may remember some of it about Modern Think, the firm that I work with, we do the research for the Great Colleges to Work For program. The survey instrument used in that program was the foundation for the survey we used here at UAB. So we went over a series of weeks and even months customizing that instrument, making sure we got the demographic questions, the various response options, the statements, et cetera, correct, so that we'd have a survey that would resonate for the UAB audience. This is what we ultimately ended up with. There were 60 core statements. There was a section about benefit satisfaction. There were 14 demographic questions, including race, gender, ethnicity, as well as job classification, school or academic area, and unit. So we've got the ability to disaggregate the data in all sorts of meaningful ways, which Alicia alluded to. There were 3 open-ended questions where we collected verbatim responses. And as you may recall, I shared in the June meeting, one of the things I characterized faculty and staff at UAB is, a lot of things that they are, but disengaged is not one of them. We literally had hundreds of pages of responses to the verbatim responses. So added some excellent kind of color commentary, if you will, to the findings we saw in the core belief statements. The survey window itself was April 12th through 26th, and our first data point is this overall response rate of 44%. And as Alicia mentioned, given some of the concerns that surfaced in the focus groups, the fact that there was a prior survey many years ago that folks didn't feel those results had been really used in the way that they initially anticipated. I think that contributed, but not the only factor that also was that emerged in the focus groups around faculty and staff, particularly staff having some concerns regarding their anonymity of their responses and whether the responses would be tracked down to them individually. So we were very thoughtful in the communications on the front end of the survey as well as in the communications during the survey to inform people about what our process was and what the systems were in place to ensure that nobody's individually confidentiality would be compromised. I think we have some evidence of that communication being effective in this first data point, the response rate. Let me provide some context for that. We do lots of different surveys for lots of different industries. While our primary focus is higher ed, We generally see lower response rates in the higher ed space as well as in healthcare. A very specific range to provide some context here. Every spring, in which we're surveying approximately 300 colleges and universities across the country in the Great Colleges to Work For program, we typically see response rates between 36 and 46%. A lot of that depends on the institution survey history and kind of what they've done historically with surveys. We see some variation across Carnegie classification as well. So out of the gate, given that you all did not have what I would characterize as a robust survey history, doing these on a regular basis, given that we had a survey in 2007 with mixed results, it's a very strong response rate. Not just anecdotally, I would characterize it as strong, but when we look at the confidence levels and the confidence intervals, we've got a really good data set here, particularly when we're looking at the overall level. We do, because of the partnership with the Chronicle and our work with the Great Colleges to Work For program, have the ability to provide some benchmarks. You'll see two here, the honor roll and UAB aspirational peers, so that we can do some gap analysis and see, what's the state of faculty staff morale here, what's the strength of the culture here at UAB today relative to some of the groups that we either aspire to be competitive with or regularly compete against. In terms of the survey instrument, just very briefly, it essentially is an engagement survey. The construct of faculty staff engagement is an evolution of the construct of employee satisfaction, which has roots in the academic research on organizational citizenship. There's not any one singular definition of what engagement is. There is a lot of consistency in the research on what influences those things, an engaged workforce, a healthy work environment, strong morale. So these are essentially the themes, dimensions, or factors that we have on this instrument. So all the statements that we alluded to earlier, those 60 core belief statements, load on one or multiple of these factors. Many of these are kind of familiar, or should be for those of you who do work in the engagement field regarding the typical drivers of engagement. So for example, we know if we were to look at, for example, one of the primary drivers of engagement is experience of one's immediate supervisor or department chair. Third column, second from the bottom up, that's an important dimension, arguably one of the most important of an engaged workforce, the folks' experience of their immediate supervisor. A growing body of research that's finding a similar result as it relates to the experience of senior leadership. So there's a group of questions that we ask about senior leadership. So again, this is the construct of the survey instrument. Response rates, I mentioned our overall response rate was very, very solid at 44%. I would also characterize the response rate of the faculty at 38% as exceptionally strong out of the gate. We typically do see lower response rates among faculty, particularly contingent faculty, where that range I gave you for the overall Great Colleges to Work For response rates is typically between 36 and 46. If we were to look at the faculty responses alone, it's probably closer to 28 to 38. It's a little bit lower. So very strong response rates. It's not atypical to see low response rates on some of the job classifications that we see here at the bottom. Sometimes that's a function of technology, access technology. Sometimes it's a function of those folks not necessarily feeling as connected or as engaged that their voice matters. So we've got some good data here. It's important for us to look at these. Certainly in the future in our subsequent surveys, we'll want to try and build on these. But out of the gate, I would characterize the communication plan that the steering committee authored to support the actual survey instrument itself was largely effective and a factor in driving these response rates. We don't have time for a full findings presentation, but in terms of getting reconnected to the data, we'll just do a quick top 10, bottom 10 analysis. That does mirror, essentially, if we were to do an abbreviated SWOT analysis, most of the themes that we would see there are in fact mirrored in a top 10, bottom 10 analysis. So let's just highlight a couple of these. Again, if we go to the engagement research, one of the primary drivers of engagement is connection to vision, connection to mission, particularly as it relates to does an individual, regardless of the role, faculty, staff, whatever the classification may be, understand how what they do impacts the institution's mission. At 90% positive, and let me just describe what we're seeing on this chart here. So on the far left column, the first number is the number of the statement in the sequence of the survey, followed by the statement itself. The following three columns, we have the UAB data, the honor roll, and then our peer benchmark. And here we're looking at percent positive and percent negative. So we would describe percent positive as the combination of the two most favorable response options, strongly agree and agree. It's a version of a top box analysis. So similarly, we do the same on the bottom end of the continuum, the lower end of the response continuum, the strongly disagrees and disagrees. So in this case, statement 5, we have a 90% positive response, a 3% negative response, as you can see, compares very favorably with the best that we can find in the Great Colleges to Work For program, that honor roll. So the honor roll, again, just to put a little more meat on the bones on what that is, the honor roll consists of those organizations that are recognized in multiple categories, multiple recognition categories in the Great Colleges to Work For program. So it's our attempt to create an aspirational benchmark as it relates to kind of the best workplaces we can find in higher ed today. So an excellent finding on that connection to mission. Related to that, and certainly much of the research which suggests even more important for our millennial generations, younger generations, is the belief that our work makes a difference in the community is one way that we look at that. Statement 49 gives us insight into that. Again, very, very favorable. 36 is not so much a driver of engagement as an outcome, sense of pride. When we looked at the results on the pride statements, as well as when we did some analysis on the verbatim responses, this was a pervasive theme, tremendous sense of pride among faculty and staff. Pride in being associated with UAB, pride in the impact that UAB is having in the Birmingham community, in the state of Alabama, pride in the impact it's having on individual students, and being simply associated with the brand. So strong sense of pride, again, very favorable with even at the best workplaces. Statement 2 here, our second to last, and statement 24 are also pretty significant in most of the engagement research. So 2 gives us some insight into the sense that faculty and staff feel empowered. I often talk about this kind of the antithesis of being micromanaged. Do folks feel like they have the autonomy they need to be effective? 24, relationship is important, but as we know, good relationship alone doesn't make for an effective working relationship, whether it be with a supervisor or otherwise. But one of the themes that does emerge in this data set, particularly in the verbatim responses, is the sense of appreciation faculty and staff have for the sense of community, the sense of camaraderie, the strength of relationships they have. It particularly plays out at the work group level or the unit level, those folks with whom people are working most regularly. It does extend to a certain extent across UAB, but the strongest is, again, at that work group level. And a nice finding as it relates to the experience of one's immediate supervisor. Second half of our bottom 10, certainly I think you'd be having to be living in a cave the last couple of years if you've not seen the headlines regarding diversity, equity, inclusive excellence that are all over our headlines every day, and probably even more acute in the higher ed space. So an important question, statement 50, do people believe that there's institutional focus and commitment to having a diverse faculty, administration, and staff? Very, very solid. That's not an isolated finding. When we look at the statements regarding DEI kind of topics, on the whole, UAB does very well. We can't be kind of lulled into a false sense of accomplishment, though, because when we do disaggregate the data by some of the historically underrepresented groups, they're not consistently strong. But at the macro level, we've got some good findings there. 29 is not a glamorous statement, but an important one, particularly in an urban environment like you all, in terms of the sense of safe environment. One is about job fit. Most of the research, not just in the engagement field, but also in terms of employee satisfaction, will speak directly to job fit, having the right person in the right role, the right people on the bus, if you will. 25 is what we would characterize as a barometer statement. Nothing really actionable in that statement. But in terms of our goals to be a place where we're considered an employer of choice or a best place to work or an organization that has high levels of engagement and morale, much of that starts at the local level. Overall, my department is a good place to work. Very solid finding there. And we also see, in addition to the good relationship with one supervisor, that supervisors and department chairs across the board, on the whole, are providing good support for work-life balance. That doesn't mean that everybody's achieved that miraculous balance, but getting good support. Okay, one of the things that also surfaced in the focus groups was not only concern around confidentiality, but concern around the results not being shared in an authentic or transparent fashion. And that was something the steering committee talked about at length, and that for this to be a different experience, to build some trust, to give people a more positive experience of survey, we had to be diligent about sharing the good and the bad, and not do anything that would potentially suggest that we were sugarcoating the results. So on that note, we looked at the top 10. We'll look at the bottom 10. So among the themes that in that SWOT analysis that I alluded to that I would characterize as an opportunity or threat was a theme as it relates to resource constraints. It manifests in a lot of different ways. One of the ways it manifests most acutely is around staffing levels, having enough people to be effective. It also manifested as it relates to compensation. You get a sense of that in Statement 11. I think there is, in some regards, oftentimes a simplistic notion that great workplaces are all about great pay and great benefits. And while there does need to be a kind of a certain level of perceived equity and fairness as it relates to compensation, both in terms of internal systems and market competitiveness, compensation and benefits alone, frankly, aren't those differentiating qualities of the best workplaces. But given where we are, particularly some of the gaps between 11 and 28, where we are today and where the honor roll is, it's, I think, important to be aware that these are, in some regards, pain points for faculty and staff alike. I think it is also important to note, just in terms of context on both of those statements, you'll note that our honor roll findings are much lower than what we've historically seen. These are challenges for colleges and universities across the country. I see we have a question. Welcome the questions. Let me get through this if I can, and then we'll go into our question and answer format. We'll have a terrific opportunity to talk more about that. Okay, so another theme that emerged in our survey results here at UAB is reflected in statements 22, 58, and 42, has to do with the quality of communication, the quality of the collaboration, and participation in decision making and understanding rationale with which decisions are made. So you see all three of those kind of dynamics reflected in both statements 22 and certainly 42, when those things are happening well, when people feel that they are talked with as opposed to talked to, that there are opportunities to participate in decisions, whether it be at the work group level or even at the university level as it relates to participation in committees or task force. When that is in play, it does tend to inform a sense that we're kind of all in it together. And we get a sense of that in Statement 58. This is what I would characterize as one of a number of differentiating qualities of great workplaces. And we see this not just in higher ed, but in other industries and sectors as well, where there is high degree of employee morale or engagement. There is a sense that everybody's kind of rowing in the same direction, that regardless of what our job classification, regardless what unit we're in, what college we're in, at the end of the day, we're all pushing in the same direction. So we've got some work to do towards that end. Our second half of our bottom 10, so we talked about communication. Folks are eager to have more communication from and with senior leadership, and the communication opportunities extend beyond just that. But when we look around the belief that senior leadership communicates openly about important matters, less than half of the population responding positively at this point today. Related, I won't say related, but in some regards it is, to the communication issue are some concerns regarding performance management processes and a culture of accountability. So in one way that manifests is Statement 18, issues of low performance are addressed in my department. This was pretty consistent across faculty and staff around the belief that on the whole, we're not necessarily very good at dealing with issues when people aren't performing to standard or when their behavior is incongruent with our either institutional values, or our unit or team level values. We've talked about communication as it relates to senior leadership communication, and it's not just about senior leadership communication. Also, one of the kind of key factors of great workplaces is the quality of the dialogue. We get a sense of that in Statement 43. You know, are we able to discuss and debate issues in a way that is ultimately going to get better results? Can we disagree without being disagreeable, right? Are we able to have conversations in the spirit of getting the best answer as opposed to our answer? So again, we see some pretty significant gaps with our honor roll institutions there. 55 and yet another communication statement. 16, performance management, similar but related to Statement 18, whereas 18 is about performance management as it relates to low performance. 16 is a perception of equitable treatment in terms of promotions. You know, as I mentioned, this is a very robust data set. We've got the ability to disaggregate the data later in the summer. After the initial findings presentation in June, we provided each of the deans and the essentially vice presidents, those who headed major administrative units, with their own report suites. They had an opportunity to talk with me about what was the kind of some of the themes and patterns in their particular areas, as well as what was happening institution-wide. For this purposes of this conversation here, we just wanted to highlight a few things where there were some, what I would characterize as notable differences between faculty and staff. While we did do 2 presentations here in June, open forums where people had the opportunity to hear us see a more substantive findings presentation, we didn't go at length in terms into detail in terms of disaggregating the data set. And just to simulate our conversation here, where we did see some notable differences regarding teaching service and research for faculty, you know, that was, in some cases, I would say, some of their concerns were certainly more acute than in terms of staff. as it relates to kind of the balance and understanding of teaching service research, as it relates to the belief that our teaching is rewarded appropriately. So some of those issues were certainly more acute among faculty, as were some of the resource constraints issues, particularly regarding staffing and facilities. And related to the first, I alluded to a second ago, the belief among many faculty that their efforts aren't necessarily not just recognized, but in many cases not even appreciated, to the extent that they're going the extra mile, working harder with fewer resources than they have in the past, that there's a lack of appreciation. Among some of the issues that were more acute for staff, the compensation, we saw some real issues there in terms of people believing that their compensation was either adequate or indeed equitable. Folks were eager, particularly on the staff side, for additional professional development opportunities, particularly when we looked through those verbatim responses. I think the number of the comments weren't necessarily coming really from a complaining perspective, but rather kind of an eagerness or interest in more opportunities to learn and grow, more opportunities to advance within the organization. We talked about performance management, and again, some of those were perhaps a little more acute among our staff population. So for those of you who've seen it, hopefully there's some familiar themes bubbling up. And with that, I'd like to transition. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Susan Cohen, who has been essentially the project manager for this, shepherding the steering committee and working closely with my colleagues at Modern Think.
Thank you, Rich. So if you had looked at the video and the first presentation, Modern Think made a set of recommendations, and through the steering committee and talking with other groups, the Senate and the Council, we've begun to think about, we're still unpacking the data, right? We've begun to think about some things that we might do to address some of the issues. And of course, there were some other specific issues that Modern Think had, as Rich noted in the top and bottom 10, for us to think about, and to think about what's actionable, what we can change, how we can take the best of our culture and move forward. So what our goal was today was to have a dialogue. To do the next part of the session is really two parts, that we're going to ask for you all, and we'll have a nice intimate discussion today, but to pull together in groups and to think about from what we learned from the survey. What questions do you have? And we're going to be passing out some white cards just to kind of keep this all in a way that we can have some documentation and be able to capture this discussion back on the website for people who maybe weren't able to come to this morning's presentation. We're going to pass out some white cards and ask you to get in groups and get your questions on cards so we can answer any questions. And I know some questions went up. We're also going to ask you to pull together in small groups and discuss suggestions. Now that you've heard what our strengths are and what opportunities we have for improvement and development, what are some ideas, some actionable ideas that you have? So we'll ask you to get into groups to do that for around 10, 15 minutes or so. So some of you will ask you to move around to some to move around and sit with some other folks, introduce yourselves if you don't know each other. In the meantime, what we're going to do is we have a wonderful panel who's invested their time today, pull the panel together, and then we'll go through round one. We'll answer your questions as openly and honestly as we can. And then in round two, we'd like to hear your suggestions and ideas. And we'll take those under advisement, and where the panel can address those, they will, because there may be some things that are already in progress. So I'd like to ask you now to pull together with groups, and your task is to come up with some questions on white cards, to come up with some suggestions on, we have various color cards for you, to select a spokesperson. And then, meanwhile, we'll convene the panel and then start an interactive dialogue. What we're going to do is I've asked the panel, obviously this is, we don't know what questions are going to come up. I've asked them when the questions come up to raise their hand, and then we can call on the appropriate person who can best address the question. So who are the spokespeople for each group? Okay, so where are my microphones?
And one note from our AV room is, as you respond, they need you to lean towards the mic or pass the mic around the table. They're not picking it up as well.
Okay, so
Does that mean I'm first with the one
you're
microphone?
first with your group's questions. Thank you so much.
All right, we had a number. We were a productive bunch here. What is the significance of some of the variations that we saw above and below the mean? Or you know, sometimes we'd be 10 above, 2 below. It's a little hard to know when those are urgently important, when they're fine, what we're concerned about, what we're not. And then what sort of specific benchmarks would we see as indicating progress, or are there specific goals? Are we being numbers driven? We want to be, you know, at the top or within 2 points. So sort of more of a sense of the traction going forward.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Happy to provide a little bit more context to that. And, you know, when we're looking at the variation, obviously you have to look at it across individual statements and by demographic groups when we're going to go into great detail. But it's a general rule of thumb. When you see a difference of 3 to 5 percentage points between a benchmark, between where UAB's results are and the honor roll benchmark or the peer benchmark, certainly at 5 points, that's not likely just a spurious statistical result. When you see that kind of movement, certainly if it's a double-digit improvement or double-digit difference, you know, that's something to pay attention to. In terms of, you know, what is expected, I think, you know, one of the things that we've done, given that UAB hasn't administered a systemic survey like this, you know, what we have now, in addition to, you know, this process, which in fact was a communication process, that, you know, survey by its very nature is that. We're asking people to tell us what they think. We play those results back. We come together. We talk about what it is we're going to do. We tap into each other's collective best thinking about solutions. So we've done that with this survey process. We've also established a baseline a baseline which we can compare against moving forward. So what I hear in your question is what would be reasonable to expect in terms of improvement, or what kind of goals should we have as regards to progress we'd like to see between now and the next administration of the survey. And, you know, my flip answer is it really does depend on what we do, right? In terms of if we're not systemic in identifying, you know, institution-wide priorities and priorities at specific college or administrative unit levels and executing on those, you know, then it's probably not reasonable to expect to see a whole lot of movement, right? But if we are systemic, and I think everything to date, you all are moving along that way. There's some efforts already in play to not just communicate levels at the academic and administrative unit, but also identify a couple institution-wide priorities, which will be a focus. So given those kind of efforts, you know, I think 3 to 5 points improvement overall is certainly reasonable to expect. I will tell you that double-digit improvement between administrations of a survey is possible, but not common.
I just want to add also that the results of this survey are this is the research that will be used to help drive and help form both the university strategic plan and then the plans that feed the university plan, whether it's the master plan of all the buildings and parking and safety and things like that, diversity, equity, inclusion strategic plan, and frankly, the university strategic communications plan. This is exactly the kind of feedback that helps form those plans to start moving the needle.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate something that was said by Rich some number of presentations ago, but in different words. And that is when you see a question where 20% of the people are responding negatively, that's 1 in 5 people who have something that they're unhappy about. And that's a significant number of unhappy people in any group that are trying to solve some problem. And so if we see a lot of 20 or above that are unhappy, like the top group of your bottom 10, then I think those are really excellent areas to look at to try to make improvement in both figures, one down, the other up.
Other questions from this group?
Are you gonna move around, or?
Yeah, we can
Okay, I'll ask one more.
ask
How's
one
that?
more and
All
then
right.
we'll move around.
This may overlap with the other one, but just the general sense is what, as you all have digested them, do these results indicate? Or what do they teach us about this university?
I think I learned several things. For one thing, during the whole planning process, I harped and harped and harped on getting any faculty to respond, because I thought that the culture that we were beginning with was one in which the faculty in particular, I can't speak for the staff, the faculty in particular, were not particularly proactive about things. They had sort of were not going, did not think surveys were worthwhile. So I was positively impressed by the fact that even though the faculty response was lower than the overall response, the staff were more receptive, that it was way higher than I was worried, which means that I think that it does reveal to us both room for improvement, opportunities, and it does reveal to us some of what our strengths are, one of which is we really feel that we're part of the community. And I think that's a really positive thing that came out of the survey.
Ann?
I want to add, the thing that blew me away was the results pertaining to institutional pride. That goes to the heart of how people feel about the university, and given what the institution endured over the last 3 years, that the sense of pride, Rich, if I'm not mistaken, it rivaled the best places to work, or the best university, it was best colleges. For that to be the case, you know, in light of some pretty high-profile crimes, and then the football issue, and just some other things that had happened, was indicative to me of a very hopeful institution and a hopeful and engaged staff. And the opportunity that I see, obviously, is around the communication, which we are working on from a actually central communication standpoint, but also a lot of the communication issues that came to the front or came to the fore in the survey seemed to be between senior leadership and communications and cascading that information down, which isn't so much a function of institutional communications as it is, you know, we need to get people sharing information from one person to the next. The information is there, it's being pushed out, it's not being communicated and shared with other people who need to know it. And I think at the end of the day, it'll probably point to the fact that we need an intranet. We have no digital water cooler for UAB. Also, there needs to be more, we'll work on alignment of leadership with senior, you know, between the deans and the administration. So that's my 2 cents.
So I would have said much the same. One of the things I was most impressed with is that the numbers on institutional pride are very good, and I think that's very difficult to change if you don't have that. So it's good coming into the survey knowing that we have a big positive on our side. The other issue, I think, is alignment in terms of the communication on issues, so that we're on the same page about different kinds of issues that are coming forward. We need to work on that more. And then the other one that I think really came out strongly is the need for more performance management, so that people feel like they're being evaluated fairly.
Great, thank you. Who's another spokesperson? We get a mic over there, Emily?
You had talked about the differences between the faculty and staff, but we were curious if you separated results between non-medical units and medical units, and not units against each other, but literally all the medical units on one side and all the non-medical units on the other, and looking at the differences in between the results on that.
Yeah, we had provided essentially report suites by all the administrative and academic units. We hadn't done a broad cut, non-medical versus medical. We could certainly back into that. There's ways we could do that. So if there was real interest in aggregating some of those groups to do that, we could. We hadn't done that at this point. We were really going more granular, giving kind of, again, school and or administrative unit heads their particular data set so they would have the ability to do deep dives there. But we certainly could do that.
Is there any sense of differences based on even those granular levels?
Sure. Yeah. No. Speak to that at a high level. We addressed this somewhat in the June presentation, but in terms of the lack of alignment that you've heard referenced here a couple of times, I would even go a little bit farther, and not just lack of alignment, but in some regards, some tensions, right? And one of the areas where that tension plays out in a number of different ways. Faculty administration, some historic tensions in terms of not necessarily a real spirit of partnership, although I think there's an evolution there, and certainly in this process we've seen more of that. I think one of the other tensions that we saw was between those in the medical side versus those who weren't, and the belief that some were perhaps better resourced or more consistently valued or appreciated, or seen as more strategic or contributing more. So there was some of that did play out.
One of the things I wanted to add is UAB Medicine has been doing a survey historically for a few years. And so with the staff, the School of Medicine staff participated in the UAB Medicine survey and not in this Modern Think survey. So we really didn't have a good, that was kind of split with the faculty. Now, we've been working very closely with the School of Medicine so that we're ready and prepared to have more uniformity the next time we do the survey. So that's also a reason why it would be difficult to really be able to get that true kind of split amongst all of the medicine versus non-medical units. But what I will say is that, many of the opportunities that we talked about have, an HR core to them. And my belief is if we address these, then that will create positive impact across our faculty and staff wherever they reside in the organization. So, and if there is a sense that something's different in one part versus the other, if we make some positive movement related to career development, performance management, some of those things, my belief is that those things will be reflected wherever you are in the organization. And that's what we're hoping to be able to do.
Other questions from your group?
Yeah, I'm just going to combine two of them into a sort of one question, but you talked about open-ended comments, and we were curious if there were any trends on some of the information that people left. But also, we were wondering so you can ask people these questions, and they can agree or disagree, but that doesn't necessarily indicate how important things are to them. So they can disagree that they get compensated enough, but that might not be as important as work-life balance or their benefits or something like that. So we were wondering if the survey asked what faculty and staff say that they would want or need to become more engaged. If you got a sense of what we need to do, not from your initial points, but what it takes for people to score higher on these things, and then what to do with those and how you prioritize those.
Sure. So let me speak. There's a couple questions in there. So we actually did have some conversation in early stages about the scales we were going to use. And I think you introduced the question of, is there merit in including not just an agreement scale, but an importance scale as well? And on some surveys, we will do that. There are some, it's an interesting dynamic with engagement surveys, because there are some things that when you ask the importance scale, it doesn't shake out the same when you do the regression analysis and some of the factor analysis to see really what is influence. So there may be things that faculty or staff rate as low, but actually is having significant impact on the overall results. So we generally kind of shy away from adding importance scales on each of the items. We do get into some of that, and I'll be able to speak a little bit more to this. In terms of the open-ended questions, the first open-ended question we ask is through an appreciative inquiry lens. What do you appreciate most about being part of this institution? And again, we saw a lot of significant and what I would characterize as a pervasive theme around this sense of pride, the sense of connection to mission, the impact on the community, and not just pride for pride's sake. I would suggest there was, one of the things that was certainly interesting to me, given some of our due diligence discovery prior to administering the survey, was the sense of optimism that was present. It wasn't just pride, but a real enthusiasm for kind of the road ahead and the potential for this university. So that's the first question. What do you appreciate most? The second question is from more of a solution-oriented perspective, what would make this a better place to work? And, what I would characterize, and again, I was probably a little bit surprised on this, is the quality of those comments. The tenor was much more solution-oriented than I might have anticipated. There wasn't a lot of negativity, a lot of, pot shots at individuals, a lot of, disrespectful, demeaning type comments. They really were much more affirming and solution-oriented. So, that's one way we can get some insight into where people think energy and time and efforts are best spent, and in subsequent meetings that we'll have. So, in our focus groups on the front end, we were trying to understand what the issues were that we needed to ask about, as well as what potential tactics we might need to employ to get good response rates. It is not atypical after a survey like this, and after the initial survey findings presentations. I think in terms of one of the things I've talked about at this point is kind of where we are in the process and survey best practice. So, the survey instrument itself, the administration of the survey, is one part of the process. We've administered the survey, we've collected data, we've got good data sets. Over the summer, we were doing what I would characterize as preliminary findings presentations, right? So the presentation we did, the open forum, this is a follow-up. We're still in the early stages of communicating the results back to the community. And I typically recommend differentiating between communicating the results and the subsequent action planning. So the charge has been to deans and vice presidents to, by the end of the year, share their specific unit level results with their specific areas, and subsequently to identify what they're going to focus on in those areas. So as those conversations happen, kind of again at that more granular level, that's where the real opportunity to, whether we do additional focus groups or whether they're more informal meetings, to tap into the wisdom of the crowd, if you will, and collect people's ideas. And part of the design of this presentation today was to create opportunities for questions and also to be able to tap into some of the good thinking that's out there already in terms of next steps.
I think that wasn't the third open-ended question around what are the top 2 or 3 things.
I'm sorry, they were.
That question was intended to get to that importance, so that as we hear all of the things that you think are positive, the things we need to where the opportunities were, is really now there may be a wide range of opportunities, but what are the top 2 or 3 that individuals felt? And we did summarize, there was a summary of that data. Rich may remember, we have it, I don't remember, but we did gather that information for that purpose.
Thank you, Alicia. I forgot about the third question. That's important.
What other questions? We still have a few minutes for questions, so we'd like to get all the questions out there.
Yeah, one other question that we had is all the actual raw data going to be released, including the qualitative comments?
Alicia, I'll take the first stab.
Okay.
Just in terms of, so the question was, is all the raw data going to be made available to folks? And this is it's a good question. It's an important question. It's one we anticipated with the steering committee prior to actually administering the survey. And given what we learned in the focus groups, and given what we heard, and given our experience at Modern Think, it was our recommendation that we not provide the raw data file to the university as a whole. Let me speak to that. That is probably it is certainly a more common approach than not in terms of our work with colleges and universities, whether it be via the Great Colleges Program or outside of the scope of that. And part of the rationale behind that is when we provide clients with the raw data file, it inhibits our ability to protect the anonymity and confidentiality of individual respondents. One of the primary reasons that universities engage a third party to work with them and support them on a survey like this is to provide that kind of arm's length transaction, to provide not just expertise in terms of content expertise around a survey process and in faculty staff engagement, but also to provide a wall, if you will, that protects the anonymity of individual respondents. So we provided you all with substantive report suites that allow you to do deep dive analysis. It doesn't necessarily allow you to do some of the perhaps advanced statistical analysis, particularly faculty may be interested in doing on that. We're not trying to prevent you from doing that. We'll happily partner with you on that. And that's, to the extent that this does surface, we do have some clients who we work with and do some of that analysis and share that with them, but we do so in a way where we're not providing the raw data file, so you all don't have the ability to do crosstabs and identify, the single white Hispanic male 50 to 60 who teaches in the Department of Latin American Studies, or whatever the case may be. So it's certainly not intended to be hiding anything. It's really, the thinking behind that is to protect the anonymity and confidentiality of individual respondents, and in what I would characterize was kind of a lower trust environment when we administered this survey. That's particularly important.
And I'll just echo there that as we recognized that was probably going to be a request, and once we completed the survey, how much data and the results do we get back out to everyone? Because we knew there was a concern about trust, and that everyone or certain people would want to see all the data. Not every person who completed the survey would want to have all the data, but we knew there would be some. But we also knew that there was a concern around trust and confidentiality and the whole confidentiality piece. And based on the feedback we got from Rich, the steering committee made the decision to err, if we were erring, to err on the side of maintaining confidentiality versus sharing all of the information. Because there's a commitment to do this survey again, and what we wanted to make certain is that there were no concerns about sharing information to the point where someone felt that their responses were not maintained in a confidential manner or that was jeopardized. So that was the reason we made that decision, was to make certain that the confidentiality was there. If there's any specific cut or report that we need, we have the partners with Modern Think that could help us to get there, but that was why we made that decision.
John, did you want to?
I just wanted to comment further on the maintaining confidentiality. The steering committee also made the conscious decision not to have too granular a survey the first time through.
Right.
And that means that the data based on departments or within a unit led by a vice president, that data is not broken down further, so that this also increases the ability to keep things confidential.
With the thinking that, based on a good experience this year, we would provide an additional level of confidence and trust in the process so that we could potentially add some of those demographics. Because that's when you can get down to that, department level area and provide a department chair, a manager, a director with a report suite as it relates to their particular area, that's when you can really supercharge some of the change, if you will.
Yeah, another question?
It actually came up a bit in conversation earlier. The challenge that our group discussed with the cascading of communication, and the trouble with cascading, where communication sometimes disappears or is distorted. And the question being, is it a culture of not sharing or lack of mechanisms in place for those who do wish to share but don't know how, or even just a lack of technology? So to hear mention of intranet communication where people can go and get communication they want or need without relying upon someone to share it and share it and share it, and how it gets to us. So I guess that's not so much a question at this point, but worth reiterating that was a big part of our conversation as well, just the ability to get information without relying upon various channels, and for people who need to communicate to have the mechanisms or technology in place in order to do that easily. So that was one point. I think we might want clarification on one thing, or one of the top 10, and we've mentioned institutional pride, and I think the one in the bottom 10 was not feeling a part of a team, and how those might relate. I have pride in my school and my institution, but I'm somehow feeling disconnected as a team. Did those relate, or how is that interpreted? Like institutional pride versus feeling part of a team.
Sure, be happy to that. So they are related. So We scored well on the institutional pride statement. There's another statement we didn't talk about where I think there's real opportunity, and it's related to pride, and it's a perception of a special or unique culture, right? And this is what I would characterize yet another differentiating quality of great workplaces at these organizations. Even in the higher ed sector, there's a sense that the culture is special, that it's unique, that it's different, that it binds us together in a way that creates a sense of community and informs a sense of pride. The pride really is informed largely by impact on students, impact in the community, and reputation, right? Those are things that are driving the pride today. So it's not incongruent to have that, but also have a finding where folks don't necessarily feel like we're all in it together. And the statement that you referenced there, it's not so much at the team, but really the reference is at this institution, right? We're all in it together. And that, earlier I talked about some of the tensions, the dynamic tensions, the strained relationships. I think that's largely what's informing and getting in the way of some of that sense of we are all in it together. I think there's some good progress towards that end, towards being more in it together. And one of the things the steering committee has been very intentional about is trying to model model some of the behaviors that we know people are eager and thirsty for. So, it's no accident that the composition of the steering committee includes the representation that it does, right? It's no accident that we did a presentation in the summer trying to be timely in terms of getting responses into the community, but then also are coming back today in the fall to do additional presentations to give opportunity for those who weren't here to present. It's no accident that we've structured this system as a means to facilitate dialogue as opposed to just share results. So I shared with you that the much of what surfaced in the survey for many were known issues, right? I don't think it was a secret to anybody or new information that we potentially can have some work to do regarding a culture of accountability or performance management. Or one of the other pieces that I think you allude to that's particularly important is the leadership competencies and leadership development. Because I think in many cases, a culture of communication, it's more than just about good tools and good processes. Certainly an intranet would be a great resource for you all. But I would wonder, in the spirit of curiosity, are those who are in leadership roles, regardless of what level of the institution they're in, do they understand what we expect of them in terms of their role in creating a culture of communication? Whether it be cascading up or cascading down, or simply being empathetic listeners to the concerns that emerge among their team. So I think there's potentially another kind of intervention point, if you will, around how we train, prepare, and support those in leadership roles to create the kind of culture that we ultimately aspire to. That was a long answer, sorry.
I'd love to move now to hear, we said part of what was really going to be important about this meeting was to hear from you, your suggestions. There was that question Alicia mentioned too that asked people open-ended, what's important and what would you do about it? But we thought it'd be great to just hear live what you all think. So again, I asked the spokespeople to go around and share some of the ideas to share with our panel. And that way, if there's some things that we're already working on, we can let you know. And either way, we'd love to hear some of what you think is important. So would you like to start? Thanks.
Y'all can help me. My group can help me on this one. So one suggestion was don't administer the survey in the second half of April, which at least for faculty is probably the single busiest part of the academic year. I mean, I know there's no good part of an academic year, but that one seems particularly intense. Another one, and I think Rich just spoke to, is sort of better or more systematic, more reliable or thoughtful training for mid-level managers and especially associate chairs, department chairs, et cetera. Sometimes the training process can feel a little ad hoc. Did we have
Others?
This survey was only given to the university side, not the medical school?
The School of Medicine faculty participated, but not the School of Medicine staff.
Okay. Is there any danger that that implementing the results of this survey might increase the divide between the two areas?
Well, we've taken a look, and I've actually been a part of this UAB medicine survey process for the last few years. The results are very similar. And I think Rich has also met with Dean Vickers on the results from the faculty survey in the School of Medicine, and they were very similar to the faculty results in the other survey that they did. So that was somewhat validating in that what we found in both surveys, that the similarities. So as I stated before, we're working on ways that we can combine them. To your point on the timing, that was also one of the challenges, is because we had that survey going on. There was an established timeline. We were trying to fit it so we could make that work, but we have a little bit more lead time, so we can work through that. But I think that having this done, validating that we had two surveys, the key issues are the same key issues for the faculty and staff within UAB Medicine and across UAB, that's going to help us create some better alignment there.
Are we going to have discussions together? I understand having a meeting on one side of campus and a meeting on the other side to make it convenient for people. When does everybody come together and come to mutual solutions?
That's what we're working on now.
And I had one other, this maybe go back into the question phase. Several years ago, I think UAB administered the NESE, the National Assessment of Student Engagement. I hadn't heard anything about it since then. I mean, so this is a naive question. Is there ever an argument for assessing student engagement sort of simultaneously with faculty staff engagement? Do those two things ever speak to one another, or are they really sort of separately siloed?
Yeah, so no, happy to speak to that. And I'm going to digress just for a second, but I will answer the question very directly. One of the things that I would characterize that we're starting to see is what I would suggest is a best practice at colleges and universities are them being more thoughtful and intentional about inventorying the various surveys that they participate in. So, many institutions have many surveys. NESE, FESI, Coach, Harry, oftentimes faculty senate surveys, staff council surveys, great colleges to work for surveys. And, unless those are coordinated, not only do you risk survey fatigue, but people don't necessarily understand how they're connected or related and why we do all these surveys. So, our counsel and recommendation is we think our clients are very well served by literally documenting, whether it be an Excel spreadsheet or some other sort of database, the various surveys that you participate, the frequency with which you do those surveys, the intentions and their uses. I think that also allows folks to kind of better integrate them so they see a more holistic survey assessment process as opposed to one-off surveys and initiatives. Your question specifically about the connection between student engagement and faculty staff engagement. In the private sector, the connection between employee engagement and customer and client satisfaction is pretty well documented. There's been lots of studies and research looking at that. Interesting that there's not been a lot of significant or substantive studies looking at the experience of faculty staff engagement and student engagement. We've started development of a student survey different from the NESE survey that we've piloted with a couple of institutions that we're trying to get a sense of that. But I've not seen any good research out there. Our hypothesis is that we'll see a similar finding. Institutions, organizations that are thoughtful about faculty staff engagement, that ultimately that does have impact on the student engagement. So that may be something for us to look at a little more specifically in terms of the next survey process. The other piece that I just want to throw into the mix, and I appreciate the suggestions regarding the administration process. The reality, as I mentioned, this is a highly complex, largely decentralized, geographically dispersed, bureaucratic, not in a pejorative sense, organization that does not have a long or successful survey history. So we try to be very thoughtful, and I think the steering committee did in terms of the administration of this, working with challenges that we knew were out there. The previous staff survey, the survey on the medical side of the house. So there were a lot of less than ideal scenarios that we had to reach some level of compromise or satisfy. And, it is common for institutions that are doing a survey like this that the learning curve, certainly in the first year, can be pretty steep, right? Whether it be the timing of the survey or other pieces. So I think the steering committee has already documented some lessons learned to improve the process. We'll continue to do that to the extent you all have suggestions or recommendations. We certainly welcome those. And, you know, candidly, I was pleased with the process from an external objective perspective, given all the dynamics you're all dealing with. I think you did a very solid job in this initial administration.
Pam, go ahead.
I just wanted to
Yeah, I'd
comment.
love to hear our other group because we're limited time, so let's hear the other
Can
recommendations.
I say one thing?
Yes,
Is that there is
absolutely.
work that's being done on chair development. So if you want to know more, I'll tell you more.
I would like to just hear from the other group because we're here for your suggestions and then we'll have the committee make final remarks. Yeah, please.
Our main idea had been sort of mentioned before, but I wanted to reiterate it because we did talk about it. Moving forward with how to solve some of these problems, we talked about it would be a great idea to have some more focus groups and people who choose to be involved, because there's some sort of irony, I think, with engagement coming from the top, right? So like the bottom-up approach to engagement needs to be strengthened and reiterated, and so some focus groups where faculty and staff can participate in strategies and ideas for moving forward is really, really important.
Thank you. Panel, any final remarks before we close it out? Anne?
Mine's just back to the Nessie survey thing, your question about student satisfaction. We're working, you'll hear a lot about the recent Nessie survey starting early November. We have the results and a communication plan around those, so we'll be sharing those out with the UAB community, and they were good, very good.
Did you want to make a, John?
Just that the other survey that faculty receive about administrators is the IDEA survey of deans and of chairs that are in alternate years. It's already been decided with the provost's office that we're going to move that survey to the fall for a couple of reasons. So that means the chair's survey will occur this fall rather than in the spring. Partly to allow more time for response within the academic year in which the survey is given, and partly to avoid some of the other surveys that occur in the spring. But to Rich's point, I agree we need a spreadsheet and a keeper of the spreadsheet so that we have all of these in mind.
I want to thank, yes, one more question or comment.
You said that we would have other surveys or climate surveys. How often? Are you planning to have them?
We're planning to do this survey again in 2019.
Okay.
And so I want to leave with 3 remarks. First, see if this, of those, the question that was asked were what were people's suggestions that we should do? And the steering committee took a look at that and wanted to make sure if we move the needle, if we try to change everything, we'll never change anything. So we identified 3 areas where we wanted to focus was leadership, starting with at the top, with alignment and a development at the top, and then moving down to the chairs and the frontline leaders, as we heard you suggest today. That'll be handled by our lead. We already have a lead UAB task force in place, and they'll continue to work that. The second was management, and in that is, as Alicia mentioned, the performance management and the HR, the people management issues that came out in the survey so that we could address people having a good experience at UAB, an equitable experience at UAB, feeling included and aligned. And then the third area was communication. And that is an area where Ann Buckley is starting a new task force, which we're just putting together now, where there'll be opportunities for you all to get involved. So we identified 3 priorities coming from the ideas, really from all the data, but the qualitative comments and what we can get accomplished. Just so you know where we are in the process, each leader and VP, each dean and VP did get a customized report for their school or unit. They are in the process right now of scheduling cascade meetings where they will be, to your point, Brandy, sharing the data and having discussions just like this, where it's not one-way communication, but having two-way discussions, asking for suggestions. So if you have not yet heard about that, we have met with each leader, and we know that those are in process and being scheduled. So look for that. And again, we're looking for, leaders, assure us they're looking for your ideas and suggestions. And then finally, changes of partnership. Thank you so much for investing your time to come today to be part of this discussion. Thank you, panel, for investing your time to come today so that we could continue to be involved. We are working closely with the Faculty Senate and the Staff Council. There'll be initiatives we envision coming through both of those groups. Please don't forget we have a website, our engagement website, where we will post this video, the results that the big results, the full results were posted that were presented in July, and we have question and answers still available through that website. So thank you so much, and I just want to end with a round of applause for your all coming and for our panel. Thank you so much.